Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Zela Astarjan, and I am an AWA board member, and I would like to welcome you to another AWA virtual event. Today, we have an open discussion about navigating the college admission and application process, which could be quite daunting, as you can imagine. During this interactive webinar, we will have a conversation with Jen Hagopian, high school guidance counselor at Acton-Boxborough High School here in Massachusetts, and also Talin Mazmanian, who's an assistant director of admissions at Tulane University, for an informational discussion on the college application and admission process. This is an opportunity to learn more about the process, gain some insight, and ask questions. So again, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A button or the chat button if you wish. Before we get into the discourse, I'd like to remind you about AWA's mission and the 3 pillars that we're currently focusing on. Our mission is simple. It is to connect and elevate Armenian women globally. I'm going to ask you to please type in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, the city and state, country from where you are connecting. And believe it or not, because of Zoom, we've had a lot of folks join us from Australia and Europe and other countries. Now 7 p.m. doesn't work for Australia, but we welcome everybody on these Zooms. So as to how we elevate Armenian women globally, we do that through 3 strategic focus areas. Number 1, health and wellness. And because as you know, supporting a woman's right and power to be aware and in control of her mental, physical, emotional, and psychological well-being is very important. And as a result, we do a lot of support for domestic violence programs. Number 2 focus area is education. And today's webinar obviously falls into this category. We believe that to educate is to liberate. And we do that by giving thousands of scholarships every year. And the 3rd area of focus is economic empowerment, because without financial freedom, women sometimes have to make some very difficult choices, as you can imagine. At this point, I'd like to turn this webinar over to Lindsay Hagopian, who's part of our AWA New England affiliate leadership group, and she's going to be hosting and moderating the webinar today. And she's had a great career in advertising. She also is an amazing yoga teacher. Anyway, I'm going to turn this over to Lindsay. Thank you, Lindsay, for helping us out today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Zela. So hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here tonight to moderate this discussion on navigating the college admissions process. It's definitely an important topic. It can be confusing and overwhelming for both students and parents, and it's constantly changing. So for those of you who went through the process yourselves years ago, there are likely additional considerations and nuances to the process nowadays. So we're fortunate to have these members from our community who can help guide us through it. Jen Hagopian is an experienced high school guidance counselor, as Zela mentioned, at Acton-Boxborough High School. She has been doing this for 10 years and has counseled hundreds of students throughout the process. She also enjoys sharing her experience guiding and coaching students through independent college counseling with an emphasis on finding their fit. She's collaborated with college admissions representatives and high school counselors presenting at the NEACAC annual conference, and she currently sits on the advisory council for Hofstra University. She has a bachelor's in psychology from Union College and a master's in education in school counseling from Salem State. Talin Mazmanian is an assistant director of admissions at Tulane in New Orleans. She primarily works with students from LA and international students. And previously she worked at the New School for 3 years, working with students interested in Parsons School of Design and Eugene Lang College of Liberal Arts. She has a degree in history from UCLA and a master's of education in higher ed administration from Vanderbilt. She is also part of the AGBU Young Professionals of Greater New York remotely from New Orleans. So as Zela mentioned, this is meant to be a conversation, so we'll go through some of the commonly asked questions. If you have any questions throughout the process or throughout the discussion, then just put them in the Q&A and we'll address them toward the end. So we'll get started with our discussion. So first of all, so for Jen, when should students start thinking about the college application process?
So first off, thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's awesome to have so many people, so many different representatives from all over. So we are psyched to be here. This is definitely a question that comes my way in a high school counseling office all the time. It definitely comes from freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and then we definitely have seniors who will come in phrasing it a little bit differently as, am I too far behind in this process to get started? So, you know, the way that I like to answer it for students is to work backwards. And that is looking at when this process ends from an application standpoint. So typically students are applying to college in the fall of their senior year. They'll have deadlines ranging from October as a very early deadline, all the way through to March, sometimes later in rare circumstances. So really, if we're working backwards, you can't submit that application or have it read. Talin's not going to read it any earlier than she is able to when her office starts the process. So from an application standpoint, seniors are submitting their applications in the fall, which means that juniors are starting this process, and they are starting it in what we call a search phase. So they're researching, they're exploring, and they're learning about different colleges and universities. And that's typically happening in the spring of junior year. And now more often is typically happening and beginning in the winter of junior year. But for freshmen and sophomores, this question comes up all the time. And there's a lot of eager students who want to start early, and there's a lot of students who feel like they should be starting early. And the best way to answer that, if you have a student who's a freshman or a sophomore, if you live in a community where there's a lot of talk about this process and the need to start, really what your child should be focusing on is getting to know themselves, getting adjusted to high school as a freshman, getting to know themselves academically, what levels are appropriate for them, what feels like a good balance in the classroom, and what are they interested in outside of school? What do they enjoy spending their time doing? And that's really what they can be doing to build their application and, you know, really strengthen themselves as an applicant, but more importantly, be true to who they are as they're looking to find the best fit for themselves 4 years or 3 years down the road. And so, you know, one of the things that we do talk about often with juniors, after you've gotten to know yourself in the classroom, after you've gotten to know yourself in an extracurricular setting, the things you want to think about as you are starting to start that search phase of the process is, where do I see myself in an academic setting and in an extracurricular setting? Do I need to be in a smaller classroom? Do I need to be in a smaller environment? Am I okay in a larger classroom with hundreds of students? Do I want to be in a city? Do I want to be in a rural area? We call this the criteria. And so as much criteria as your child can be talking about and thinking about in their junior year, that's really going to help you as you start to explore schools more. And I often tell students it is just as valuable to walk away from a campus and say, I hated that, as it is to walk away from a campus and say, I loved that. So that's how we would really kind of answer that big question. There's so many different routes you can go with it, but that's really how we like to answer that question for students who are wondering when they can start.
Great. Thank you. Talin, were you going to add something, or are you?
No, I think that was very well put, Jen. Yeah, I think it's never too early to start, but you definitely don't want to start stressing yourself out too much in the very beginning. I think the bulk of, you know, exploring what kind of school you want to be a part of really does start, you know, probably your junior year.
And so what are some of the key components of the application, and how did those play out over the course of the process?
Yeah, so hopefully nobody's really looking at the application just yet, but just to let you know what's coming down the pipeline, a lot of universities are going to require students to submit via the Common App. I believe about 1,000 universities use the Common App. So most likely you or your student is going to apply via the Common App. So the way that that's going to work is it is going to take everything that your student has done in the past 3 years. So combining things like all their extracurricular activities. So we can talk a little bit more in depth on what that actually means, but essentially everything a student has done outside of the classroom. So some students don't realize, if they had a part-time job, that they should include that in their extracurricular section. If they've had to take care of their grandparent or maybe a sibling, that is something that's taking away from their ability to be able to study. So something that we want to see on their extracurricular section. You'll see that it is kind of set up to, it's kind of similar to a resume format. So we definitely want students to give us a little bit of context and what they're doing in each extracurricular section. And then there's also going to be an essay component. Not every single school is going to require the students to submit what is considered the Common App essay, which is essentially a personal essay. But I would say that, you most likely they will end up submitting it because that's going to go to every single college that they apply to. So there's 6 different topics a student can choose when they are submitting the personal essay. I would say, and maybe Jen, you can agree to disagree. I would say that the essay is an important part of the application, but it's not something that I would say students should stress over too much. Definitely, take your time. Think about what you maybe want the essay to be about in the summer, because senior year, everything is just going to go by really, really fast. And in addition to the Common App essay, a lot of schools will actually ask students to submit also an additional essay, like a supplemental essay. For example, I work at Tulane. We do not require this. It is actually listed as optional, which we can talk about later as well. But we have an optional essay about why a student wants to come to Tulane. So that's part of the supplemental portion of the Common App. I guess let me just rewind a little bit to say the Common App is going to be sent to every single school that a student applies to. I believe that they have limited to 20 schools that you can set the Common App to. So every single school is going to get essentially the first 8 pages or so of the application. And then whatever schools you apply to, they might ask for supplemental essays, supplemental questions. In addition to that, letters of recommendation generally will go to every single school that a student has applied to, unless the teacher or the counselor sends it directly to the school. So, sometimes we get letters of recommendation that say, Johnny would be a great addition to Duke University, but obviously that's going to every single school. So just keep that in mind when you're doing the application, or when your child is doing the application, that for the most part, that is going to go to every single school that they have listed on the Common App. And the Common App, is a really, the essay prompts don't generally change. So definitely something that your student can start to look at the summer before senior year. Other than that, it doesn't open generally until August. So nothing that they have to worry about just yet, but just to start thinking about those essay topics. I think I just went on a really long rant. So Jen, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add.
No, I think that was perfect. Yep, echoed all the same things.
Yeah, and I know that the UC system, I know somebody asked a question about the UC system. They'll have their own application, and the same thing applies, where that's going to go to every single school. So just keep that in mind.
And so about how many schools should students think about having on their list?
So, I think Talin and I have similar responses to this, and I think it really highlights the difference in being on one side of the desk or the other, right? So we both agree that really, before we give it a number, your list should be a balance of what we call your reaches, your matches, and your likelies. And so your reach schools, most high schools are using a platform. Typically it's Naviance or Score at this point. And those databases house all of the data from typically the past 5 to 10 years of that high school's applications to all of the different colleges and universities. and it tracks who has been accepted, who has been waitlisted, who has been denied, and it should show you some data to go with that. So you'll see the, the different plot points of a student's GPA and test scores, but you won't see their name. You'll see what the outcome was at any particular school that they apply to. So this serves as a guide for students who are trying to identify, is this school a reach for me, a match for me, or a likely? And the reaches are typically those schools that are not far. You might not be so far from that average GPA or test score that it's out of reach, but you're slightly below the average that you see accepted from your high school. Those matches, you should be surrounded by a pretty good odds of students who are getting accepted to the school. You're right in the mix there. And the likelies are the schools that you're going to see that these are what we call your slam dunks. And so you really want to have a balance of all three of those on your list. We don't want a list that is totally dominated by those reach schools. So if we're breaking it down to numbers, because I know people really like the concrete information, that the answers that they can get when they can get them in this process, we recommend anywhere from 6 to 8, although I will say we're seeing definitely more of that 8 to 10, 8 to 12 range these days, since college admissions has shifted with COVID. So breaking it down from anywhere from 2 to 3 reaches, the bulk of those, in the 4, 3, 4, 5 range of your matches, and then 2, 3, 4 range of your likelies. I don't know, Talin, if you have other thoughts to add on that.
No, I think that 8 to 10 is perfect, because you just want to make sure that you are, setting yourself up for success, but also giving yourself the opportunity, if you do have that dream school, to give, maybe it will work out. Like, you never know, so you might as well try. But I would say that definitely I wouldn't be the student that fills up the Common App with the 20 schools, because so many of those schools are going to ask for, these supplemental information. And, you definitely want to spend your time focusing on the schools that you're actually interested in. And if you, spread yourself too thin, then maybe a lot of your applications won't come out strong. So just focusing on the schools that you're actually interested in.
And a lot of these schools have an application fee as well. So you're going to find that if you are applying to 20 schools, that can be a really big financial commitment for families as well. So that's why we also try to help families be mindful of how many applications they're encouraging their children to apply to. And sometimes that requires just a real honest conversation up front about how many applications you're willing to put the application fee out for. So definitely a lot of things to think about in that area, but definitely, I would say the typical that we are seeing is that 8 to 10 now, more and more.
So here there are a couple of questions that kind of align with the next few questions that we have to address. So I'm just going to pause and ask. So we were going to talk about freshman year and whether grades count. We have someone asking if freshman grades count in the GPA. So let's talk a little bit about that.
I can take this, and then Jen, if I'm missing anything, you can add on. So freshman grades do count in the GPA. So every university is going to look at grades a little bit differently. So for example, every school that I've ever worked at, we focus on the unweighted GPA. But that doesn't mean we're just solely looking at the number when we're looking at the GPA. It's kind of just like giving us an overall understanding of the student. But of course, if the student had a really, rough transition going from high school to college, they had a rough freshman year, but then sophomore year, junior year, they're doing really well. They're also, challenging themselves, taking honors classes, AP courses, and still doing really great. That GPA is not going to be a reflection of how we see the student, especially if it is a lot lower than, their sophomore and junior year. It is still taken into consideration, but it's not as heavily weighted as their most recent grades. And if they're applying, regular decision, we'll also see their first semester senior year grades. So sometimes when a student doesn't do particularly well their freshman year, sophomore year, they bring it up, junior year, even better. Sometimes we do, recommend students actually pushing and applying regular decision if they anticipate that they're going to continue to do better senior year.
Yep, and I totally agree with that. And I think from the high school side of things, we often see freshman year is a really big transition and it's a really tough jump. So especially now more than ever with the return to school full-time with COVID, we are definitely seeing that the freshman year is not an easy one for students to adjust to. So I think that, definitely feel as though, what Talin is saying is, I think take that really to heart, because I think if you can relieve that pressure just even a little bit on your child, I think that can go a long way.
And then another question, I heard that admissions and scholarships are done by computers. Any tips?
Talin, that's all you.
I don't know. Let me know if I'm not understanding the question exactly, but yeah, there's a lot of scholarships that students can do online. I actually don't know if there's any that aren't online nowadays, but I would start, we're saying senior year is going to come by really fast. So one of the things that I always recommend students doing the summer before senior year is, start thinking about the essay, but also start researching scholarships, because there's going to be a lot of universities that you apply to that will have scholarships that you can, submit an application to sometimes before you're admitted into the institution. So you just want to do that research, see when those deadlines are. But in addition to, specific universities that you're going to apply to, there are a lot of different scholarships that you can look online, like on fastweb.com. I'm sure Jen has a lot more resources that she can offer. But I don't think people realize that, you can get a scholarship with Coca-Cola or with Lego, and it could be quite a lot of money. But just making sure you keep track of those deadlines, because even students this year, they emailed me the day after our scholarships were due, and there's nothing that I can do about it. The deadline is over, the application is closed. So just keeping, maybe an Excel spreadsheet with every university that you're thinking about, their, early action, early decision, regular decision deadlines, plus their scholarship deadlines, because those can cover quite a lot. And there's a lot of universities where once you are an enrolled student there, there's no other scholarships that you can apply to, or they're really minimal. So you definitely want to start looking into the scholarships early on.
Okay. Talin, I don't know if part of the question was wondering about merit aid. I don't know if that's something that you could just touch upon really quickly. I feel like maybe that's kind of where it was meaning to go.
Sure. Everything I said was about merit aid, by the way. So merit aid is, for those of you that don't know, there's a difference between merit aid and need-based aid. So need-based aid is depending on the student's need, what their EFC is, expected family contribution is. So that's when you generally fill out the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. And sometimes in addition to that, the CSS profile. So the FAFSA is through the government, and then the CSS profile is institutions that are able to give need-based scholarships to students. So you will not be considered for need-based aid if you don't do either the FAFSA, and then for some schools, both the FAFSA and the CSS profile. These are pretty long processes. So definitely, start thinking about that, gather the tax forms and all that stuff that you will need. But that's all need-based aid. Merit-based aid, even if you don't submit the FAFSA and the CSS profile, you will still be considered for merit aid. Some schools, mine, for example, you'll automatically be considered for merit aid when you apply. So there's nothing that you have to do, but generally the automatic ones, they're kind of limited. So it can range from a couple $1,000s a year to maybe up to 20 or 30,000. It really depends on the university, but for the most part, those automatic ones that you don't actually have to do a separate application for, they're going to cover like a third of the cost, half of the cost. But sometimes the ones that actually require an application can cover, the full cost of attendance, full tuition. You just have to look into each different scholarship and see what is being offered. But yeah, like you'll see that there's a lot of schools that you will have to apply for those before you even know you're admitted into the institution. There's going to be some that you can apply for afterwards, but definitely doing your research early on is going to be very helpful, so that you're not stressing about it while also doing the application and, the FAFSA and the CSS profile all at the same time.
Okay, so let's get into a few other elements. So do all students have to take AP courses? That's one topic that I think are on the minds of a lot of high school students. Do I need to take all of these AP courses? How many do I take? All of that. So
You go for it, Jen.
So I can start, and then I think this is another great question that both sides of the desk really are important. And so I think the first part is that, it's definitely not a one size fits all answer to this question. There are so many different colleges and universities that are going to be looking for all different things. So it really is somewhat centered around the colleges and universities that your child is looking at. If the end goal for every single person is Harvard, it would be disingenuous of me to sit here and say you don't need to take AP courses to get into Harvard. That would not be the truth. So, it really, the way to first answer that is, first, you have to look at your list, and you need to do a lot of research and listening to info sessions and hearing from admissions about what are they looking for in an applicant. I think the high school side of it is really, the focus is balance. And so if you have a child who is stretching up to an AP level course, but they are finding it particularly challenging, and they are in the D range in that class, an AP class with a D as a final grade on the transcript is not going to show that your child is balancing their course load and knows themselves as a student. If your child is capable of working hard at the AP level and doing well without compromising their mental health, without losing sleep, without giving up things that they really enjoy, that will also be valuable on their application, that is where we would say we would encourage students to jump into that AP level and find that balance of how many they're able to take. It is certainly not a one size fits all, and it really is centered around where the colleges and universities that your child is looking at. But I really caution students who are going to jump into all APs and really struggle or compromise their mental health in any way. But I certainly don't want a student to say, I'm going to stay in this lower level, get all A pluses, and show them that I can, get into any college I want to. So it really is, unfortunately, not a clear-cut answer, but it really does come down to your child, where they're looking, what they are able to manage and balance. That's definitely the high school side of it. So I don't know how Talin's side of it might be a little bit differently.
No, it's pretty similar. So, whenever a student asks me about AP tests, AP classes that they're thinking about taking, I always ask them, is the regular version of that going to be a little bit too easy for you? And are you going to be okay taking the AP version of that class? If it's a class that you're already struggling with in the regular version, you don't need to take the AP version and struggle in it. And like Jen said, like getting a D in an AP class versus getting an A in the regular version class, like we would rather, or even the B in the regular version class, we would rather see that. But I don't work at a Ivy League institution. I know that they view AP classes probably a lot differently, but for the most part, most universities are going to encourage students to take some classes that are challenging within the context of their high school. So when a student submits their application, their counselor will also submit a school profile to tell us more about their specific high school, because there's going to be high schools where maybe your high school doesn't have any APs or honors classes, or maybe they just have a few, but then there's a student across town where they have over 10 AP offerings and over 20 honors classes. So we're not going to review those transcripts the same exact way. We just want to see that the student is challenging themselves within what is available to them. So that doesn't mean that that student that has over 30 different course offerings has to take every single one of them. And it also doesn't mean that the other student has to take every single one. We just want to make sure that they are, picking courses where they are challenging themselves a little bit, but not to the extent of having to have sleepless nights studying all the time. But again, I'm speaking just in general. There's going to be some institutions, maybe like a Harvard, I'm not quite sure, that are requiring some, number of AP courses. I'm not quite sure about that. But for most institutions, it's kind of just a holistic review process of, making sure that, there's a good balance essentially.
Okay, so we do have a question tied to that, and then there are a couple other questions coming through. And so to be mindful of time, I'm going to go to those, but someone just asked what grades are too low for an AP class. If a student is taking a lot of AP classes and getting Bs, would you recommend they drop some so they can get As in regular classes?
I don't see that one here, so I'm trying to just.
It's in the Q&A section. But
Am I just saying it one more time? Just.
what grades are too low for an AP class? If a student is taking a lot of AP classes and getting Bs, would you recommend they drop some so they can get As in regular classes?
I think this is where it does come back to that first part of the previous answer, which is just, it's really all centered around where they're applying. So I think my personal response, if this is a student that I'm working with and they're getting Bs in their APs, I would not be encouraging them to drop down. I think a B in an AP level course is demonstrating that that level is appropriate and that they are doing well in what we know is a common curriculum and a challenging curriculum. So I would not be advising a student in general to drop down, but again, a lot of things are centered around the conversation of the list. But if I had to give a counselor response in a brief answer, I would say stick with the Bs in the AP level course.
Yeah, I feel like that's a hard question to answer because it's so specific depending on the institution, because there's going to be really competitive like engineering programs that are going to want to see A's in the AP courses and things like that. But for me, if a student is getting a B in an AP class, that's great. We're not going to hold that against them at all.
And then there is another question, and then we'll get into SATs and all of that, where there is another question regarding standardized testing. But what do colleges focus on more in the application process? Grades, extracurricular activities, both? And I think, Jen, I know we've had some conversations about this too, and what colleges are considering nowadays, but I think to have that context would be great.
Yeah, so I think, I think the goal is well-roundedness. And I think more importantly, the goal is being able to, if I'm Talin and I'm reading applications, I would love to be able to really get to know a student from reading their application and seeing different themes emerge and seeing consistencies over the span of 3 years, 4 years before that student applies. So I think that the easy answer is that everything is definitely being looked at. Size matters for colleges and universities as well. So there are some schools that are getting thousands and thousands of applications that they need to use the numbers more so than some other schools to be able to get through more applications in a shorter period of time. But in general, and this is definitely emerging from COVID as well, is that holistic approach that Talin touched upon is really happening more than ever, where they're looking at the grades, they're looking at the extracurriculars, they're looking at test scores if they have them. And I mean, I think what's important to note too is that these years of this admission cycle, there are gaps in things like grades, right? There are holes that are left on transcripts because schools shut down. There are grades that are totally different from in sophomore than junior year because they were in school half the time, right? So there's a lot of different factors. So as I kind of shift this over to Talin to answer, I have to say, like, I don't necessarily envy your job, Talin, because you guys are doing a lot of digging in the application. So it's definitely tough right now.
No, and I think it's a hard question to answer because it really just depends. So most institutions are going to be holistic in their review process. So the grades are important, but we also want to see, students, getting involved in their school, getting involved in their community. That doesn't mean that the student has to do everything. There can be a student that, and I'm just speaking, in general, there's going to be some institutions that are going to be looking for very specific things, but for the most part, if there's a student that has one activity on their extracurricular section, but it's an activity that they do, 30 hours a week, maybe they're a gymnast, maybe they have to work part-time, there's no other time for them to, they have no time to do anything else. We're not going to hold that against the student, but if it's a student that's just like, oh, I'm in French club and that's the only thing that they do, we definitely want to see a little bit more than that. And maybe like some consistency, some leadership skills. I know it's going to be hard, especially because maybe, 9th and 10th grade was difficult because of COVID. But I feel like there's unique ways to get involved in things. And again, for most schools, they're not requiring students to have like 10, 15 activities. As long as they're really focused and things that the student's passionate about, that's really what we're looking for. And then grades wise, for the most part, no institution is going to have a minimum GPA. There is going to be some. I think maybe even the UC system might have a minimum GPA requirement. I'm not quite sure. But for the most part, most institutions are going to review the grades holistically as well. So there's no, cutoff. But we like to see, an upward grade trend. We like to see students challenging themselves. For the most part, a lot of institutions are receiving applications of qualified students. I would say probably 75% of the applications that an institution is getting, the students are qualified to attend that institution. With great work from counselors like Jen, they're applying to the right kinds of institutions. But there's only a selected number of spots available. So we're not just focusing on the grades. We're not just focusing on the extracurriculars. We're looking at everything. We're looking at the essay, letters of recommendation, the optional essay sometimes. So there's just a lot of factors coming into play. And that's why it is important to have, going back to the college list, to have, a university where you're most likely going to be admitted into, some match schools as well as some reach schools.
And what does demonstrated interest mean? And does that really factor into a college decision?
Oh, I'm glad you just asked that, because I was going to go into it, but then I decided not to. So with some schools, demonstrated interest is a big component of how they decide who is going to be admitted into the institution. As I just said, there's a lot of institutions where they're getting qualified applicants. So how are they going to narrow it down to, the handful of students that are going to be admitted? So one way is demonstrated interest. So what that actually means is a student has done their due diligence, they've learned about the institution, and they're making an educated decision about applying. So, I'm going to feel confident that this student knows about the university, that when they get to the university, they're going to be happy and excited to spend time there. So, for example, Tulane is a school that takes demonstrated interest into account. So we look at things like, did they attend any virtual events? Doesn't mean they have to come in person. We don't want that to be a barrier. Most institutions won't have that be a barrier, but we want to see students engage with us. A lot of schools offer optional interviews. They're truly optional because there's no way like an institution can interview every single student. But a lot of students, a lot of schools also have an optional essay about why a student wants to go to that university. I always tell students, if there's something that's optional, as easy as an essay for a student to do, just go ahead and do that. You're going to be setting yourself up for more success. Because, for example, if Jen applied to a university that looked at demonstrated interest, but then she decided she wasn't going to do the optional essay, but then Lindsay applied to the same school, they have roughly around the same grades, very involved students, good letters of recommendation. And then Lindsay decides, actually, I'm going to write the optional essay because I've been on these virtual webinars. I really like the institution. I have a lot to say. Obviously, I'm going to feel more confident that Lindsay has done her research and that she's going to be a good fit for the institution. So you're setting me up for success as the counselor, that, I feel like I'm making a confident decision in, that when you get to the university, you know about the university and you're not going to essentially transfer and go somewhere else too. So that is a long-winded response about demonstrated interest, but it is something to look for, because there are going to be some institutions that highly do look at that.
Yeah, and I would just say that's exactly, it's nice for us to hear as counselors from admissions themselves. And I think we're not expecting, nor are colleges and universities expecting, that you're going to show the same amount of demonstrated interest to every single school on your list. But if you have top schools, top 3, top 2, that are really, favorites on your list, we would encourage, you may not know if demonstrated interest is something that is important in the admissions process for that school. So we would encourage, as high school counselors, to show your demonstrated interest as if it does matter. If those are your favorite schools, if those are your top choices, do everything you can within your control, because at some point, to Talin's previous point, there's a lot of great applicants out there. And sometimes it doesn't come down to anything you're doing wrong. And it just comes down to so many people are doing things well. So, that's where we would just encourage students to do everything that you can within your control for those favorite schools on your list. And then, at the end of the day, you did all that you could. And the decision is the decision, and likely not because your child is doing anything wrong.
Yeah, and I feel like, just to not add additional stress to the college process, that doesn't mean you have to, attend every single event ever offered by the university. It's kind of just like, make sure you've done enough that you get a clear understanding of the university. And that way, when you do write your essay, it's a stronger essay too, because you have more to say. And also, it doesn't mean that you have to email every single person in the admissions office. Generally, that's not something that universities will even track. But if you do have questions, that's what we're here for. I just don't want to add to the any additional stress to the college process.
Great, thanks. And so then I do want to touch upon standardized testing. So we do have one question: where do you think it's going to go in the next few years? I know that MIT is going back to requiring tests. Do you think other top schools will follow, despite the UC system being test blind? And then I also know that there are schools that are test optional, or so I know a lot of schools aren't requiring them, or like they did in the past as well. So
I mean, I don't know what will happen. I think that's, we just announced a week or 2 ago that we're going to be test optional for the new class, but we don't know what's going to happen going forward. And I think a lot of universities are kind of in that same boat. I think they're trying to determine, what's going to happen with the first class once they graduate from the university, and see if it ended up working out. I'm not quite sure what their logic is. But we're all keeping our fingers crossed that we'll remain test optional. But test optional is kind of a confusing term for some people. So just for those of you that don't really know what that means, so for a lot of universities, they have become test optional because of COVID. Some institutions were already test optional. It was pretty rare, but now with COVID, it's been harder and harder for students to be able to take the SAT or the ACT. So a lot of universities have opted to be test optional. So what that actually means is, if you submit a test score to a college, they will take it into consideration. So if you want them to see your test score, they still have that as an optional viewing for them to do. But if you're a student that, maybe you had a bad day, maybe you didn't, do too well on the test, and it doesn't really reflect your true potential, you don't have to tell the university about that. And there should be no repercussions. They will not review your application in any way differently. They will just exclude the testing out of the application component. There are some universities, while they are test optional, for some scholarships, they still will require the SAT or ACT. So you definitely want to be looking out for what institutions those are. I think it's becoming less and less of a thing, but I'm sure, Jen, you might have a little bit more context about that.
Yeah, I think that is more something that with this admission cycle, we are encouraging students and families to ask in info sessions to really make sure you get that answer, because this is the wild card year slightly. We knew that most schools were many schools were gonna stay test optional, but it was definitely not as clear as it was for the previous 2 admission cycles. And we're still waiting on some schools to announce what their plan is. So I would definitely say that this is a place that even in the last admission cycle, as a counselor, I encouraged students to really make sure that they were getting that answer, directly asking, are you test optional? Will you be test optional? Do you use it to calculate merit aid, for every single school on their list, just so that there's no hiccups along the way. And it really does become a conversation based on each individual school and looking at that data in Naviance or in Score, where you should send them and where you shouldn't. And I have not felt as a counselor that it is that there are repercussions if you don't send them. The trends that I would say are being seen in the high school counseling offices are that the SAT and ACT scores that are being submitted are just that much more competitive than they have been in the past. So I think, don't worry about those students who aren't sending them. We just want to make sure we really look at that data for those students who are going to send them, I think is really where we've landed with that recently. And then I just saw a question pop up that I think makes sense to add in there is, how do you decide which tests you take? As high school counselors, we really encourage that you try both and see if you like one more than the other. The ACT does have a science component to it, so that is sometimes a draw for students. They like to take it and have that additional testing section. So, but it really depends on your child. The SAT has revamped over the years to try and mirror and look more similar to the ACT in the way that they're asking questions. So what used to be 2 very different tests are not as different as everybody once knew. So, but it certainly makes the most sense if you do have, take practice tests, take the PSAT, take a practice ACT. That's a nice way to kind of get a sense of which format you like better. And if you like both, you can certainly take both the real way and see how both of those go and make a testing plan with your counselor after that.
Great. And then there are a couple other questions that I wanted to address. So are you disadvantaging your kid if you send them to a junior college first for financial reasons and to allow them to figure out what they want to do?
So as a high school counselor, I love this question because of the financial side of it. And I really do wish that more students were taking advantage of this route to higher education. But in terms of like the transfer game, that's definitely more, Talin, an area that you could speak to.
I was just going to say, it really depends on the institution itself. There's some institutions that are very transfer friendly. So most of the time, those are going to be, your public state schools, but private institutions generally a little bit harder because they also take less transfer students, and then transferring credits a lot of them can get lost in the process. So if I would say it's not disadvantaging if they have a game plan and they have, a few top schools that they're looking at, and maybe just connect with that school early on to make sure that they're taking the right kind of courses that will potentially transfer over. I think it's just a lot easier when it's a state school, but I don't know, Jen, if you have any more context.
Just with the Massachusetts state school system, it is definitely an easy access from the community college system to the public university system. So totally agree with you on that part. And then, but again, I think ideally we would love to see more students go this route because it is a really great financial option for students. And we do, find students are, sometimes they're just not sure what they want. And sometimes they feel like they have to choose a major because otherwise it is going to be a waste of money. So I love this question. And I think, it's a really, really great thing to be considering. And I definitely would say that the Massachusetts public school system, at least, has some really great value to it. So definitely something to consider.
Yeah, California schools too. And they have especially for California, they have a lot of transfer agreements. So you could also be looking to see, what community colleges have, which community colleges have agreements with which universities too.
And then we're running close to time, so I do want to get to the last couple questions in here. So how does being Armenian play a factor in terms of diversity of the applicants admitted at Tulane? What is the Armenian community like? And then, so if we can do those, and then there's one more question that we'll get to.
So sadly, the Armenian community is very low at Tulane. We do have an Armenian community within Louisiana, and we have an Armenian church, but there's not that many Armenian students in general at the university. It's a pretty small university, though. We're about 7,800 students, so it's not, one of the big California universities. Regarding diversity, it is something that we look at for all students. So it's great to see, especially students bilingual, but it doesn't play like a major part in, why a student is admitted or not. I think it's more about their, maybe they had a really great personal story that they wrote, and that has something to do with them being Armenian. But I would say it's not a big factor in the admission decision.
And then another question to that, which I know is a big one. As Armenians, should we identify as white?
I think that most of the Armenian students I see write that they're white. I don't really know if there's another option, but generally they'll write white, and then I think in parentheses it's like Middle East, and then they'll write that their like primary language is Armenian.
And then the last question was how early should or often should students speak to their high school counselors to make sure they're on the right track?
So I would definitely say it never hurts to hopefully the high school counselors that your child works with, it has a process and a curriculum in place that is, making them accessible for your child to meet within groups and individually, but the sooner the better. As high school counselors, we write letters of recommendation for every student. It's pretty, I would say most high schools, that is the case, not all, but so the more that I have a chance to see my students and meet with my students, the better I get to know them. And in turn, that means, my letter of recommendation can really be from my experience with the student. And then in terms of making sure that they're on the right track, there should be a process, especially for juniors and seniors, for juniors and seniors to be called into the counselor's office. But I would definitely say that, the sooner that you can get into your high school counselor's office in junior year, it certainly won't hurt. And the more interactions you have, it's only going to help you stay on track as a student and help them get to know you more. So I encourage them to go in to talk about course selection, ask questions about the application, ask questions about extracurriculars, whatever, just develop that relationship. And then it really benefits both the counselor and the student.
Great.
Lindsay, what do you think? Did we cover all the questions? I love
There
all the questions.
There was just one more that we got to everyone's questions that they asked. The last one we didn't get to on our list was how a student picks who they want to write their letters of recommendation.
So when it comes to letters of recommendation, the formal letters of recommendation are what go directly to the school. And a really common question is if you as a parent and your child are going to get to read those. And the answer is no, you should not be reading those before they go to Talin. Talin's eyes should be the first ones on that letter of recommendation. And as you're trying to help your child, or if your child is really struggling to identify who to ask, the best recommendations come from, examples of experiences or situations that they've, had a chance to collaborate with their teacher. Maybe they're a great volunteer or participant in class. Maybe it's a class that they started out struggling in and then worked really hard and brought their grade up. It doesn't always have to be the teacher that they got the A+ in. So you really want to think about the relationship with the teacher, the experiences they've had with the teacher. I love when a student tells me that they've had a teacher and then they also have that teacher as an advisor of a club. So those, relationships are key. And then really thinking about like examples that they can use in that letter of recommendation, or what I would encourage them to think about, and trying, if you can, to really make sure that it's a junior year teacher that's the most relevant picture that the admissions counselor is going to be able to get of your child in the classroom. And then, an additional factor that we try to have students consider is balancing out the different subject areas, but sometimes it doesn't always work out that nicely to balance the humanities with the math science. But all of those factors are things to be considering. Talin, I don't know if there's anything I missed in that one.
Just if a university is asking for 2 letters of recommendation, please do not submit 6, 7, 8 recommendation letters, because we won't be able to get through them. So you're running the risk of the counselor reading 2 that maybe weren't as strong as the other 6. So definitely less is more. You can always do a little bit more than what is the minimum, but I wouldn't go overboard.
Right. By the way, I was asked if you're comfortable sharing your contact information on the chat. That would be great. Or maybe your LinkedIn profile name, if you don't mind. That would be great. Anyway, I want to personally thank you. Really, I feel like you did an amazing job answering the questions. I want to thank the attendees also, because I feel like they had some great questions. And we had attendees from across the US, from California to Massachusetts. Very happy about that. So please look out for future AWA events and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you're not an AWA member, we encourage you to join our website and become a member and be part of our community. Our goal is to engage women, connections, enhance well-being, elevate leaders, and empower. Stay well, stay healthy. We also have a survey at the end of this program, so please take 2 minutes. I promise you it's very short, to let us know what future topics you want us to cover. And feel free to email us at info@awainternational.org. Thank you so much, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.